Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a fascinating and often misunderstood corner of history, the way ancient societies viewed race, color, and identity. Now, when we think about racism, we often assume it's something that's been around forever, that human beings have always organized themselves by color, by black and white. But Frank M. Snowden Jr., a classical scholar and historian, says, "Hold on, that's not true." His book, Before Color Prejudice, The Ancient View of Blacks, takes us back thousands of years, to Greece, Rome, and the wider Mediterranean world, to show that skin color didn't always carry the meanings, or the moral weight, that it does today. So let's set the stage. Imagine the ancient Mediterranean, bustling ports, traders from Egypt, sailors from Nubia, soldiers from Rome, and merchants from Carthage. People of every shade, crossing seas and deserts. Contact between Africans and Mediterranean peoples wasn't rare. It was part of the fabric of life. Snowden points out that Greeks and Romans had been seeing, talking with, and trading alongside dark-skinned Africans, what they called Ethiopians, meaning literally burnt face, for centuries. So by the time you get to the classical era, these weren't mysterious outsiders. They were familiar. And that familiarity mattered. It kept people from building rigid categories around skin color. Snowden's central claim is actually pretty bold. He argues that the ancients didn't have color prejudice the way we think of it. Sure, they noticed skin color, art and writing make that obvious, but they didn't tie it directly to social worth, intelligence, or moral standing. In other words, blackness wasn't automatically a synonym for inferiority. That's a huge idea, especially when you realize how much of later European racism tried to ground itself in ancient tradition. Snowden says, "No, that's a historical myth." So what kind of evidence does he use? A lot of it comes from art, literature, and archaeology. If you look at ancient Greek vases or Roman wall paintings, you see African figures shown in all kinds of roles: soldiers, athletes, even gods. Their blackness is depicted accurately, even proudly, not caricatured. There's variety, dignity, realism. Snowden argues that this visual record tells us something deep. People with dark skin weren't systematically portrayed as monsters, slaves, or villains. They were part of the story. Now, that doesn't mean ancient societies were colorblind utopias. Far from it. They had slaves, wars, hierarchies, endless hierarchies. But slavery, for example, wasn't color-coded. You could be enslaved in Greece or Rome if you lost a war, fell into debt, or were captured by pirates. It had nothing to do with your skin. And in the same way, you could also rise above slavery, gain freedom, status, even citizenship regardless of color. One of Snowden's most striking points is about how the ancients described blackness. Writers like Herodotus, the great Greek historian, talked about the Ethiopians, the people living south of Egypt, and said they were the tallest and best-looking men on earth. Homer, in the Iliad, even describes the gods themselves visiting the Ethiopians, calling them blameless. Think about that for a second. Divine guests of the gods. That's a far cry from the degrading stereotypes that would dominate later centuries. Even Aristotle, though he noted physical differences among peoples, didn't construct a racial hierarchy based purely on color. The Greeks and Romans might have thought their own culture was superior. They definitely did. But that was about language, laws, and customs, not pigment. Snowden also looks at how black individuals could move within the ancient world. Some Africans served as mercenaries in the Egyptian and Persian armies. Others were traders, ambassadors, or skilled artisans in Rome. They appear in inscriptions and portraits, often with names that reflect full participation in Mediterranean society. And remember, the Roman Empire was huge. It stretched from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. Mobility was normal. Diversity was baked into everyday life. So while there were certainly prejudices and stereotypes, jokes about foreigners, cultural chauvinism, all the usual human mess, Snowden's point is that there was no systemic ideology that said black equals inferior. That's a crucial difference. Snowden asks, why didn't that ideology appear? Why, after so many centuries of contact, didn't the Mediterranean world develop the kind of color-based racism that became dominant in later Europe? His answer is partly historical, partly psychological. First, the ancients were used to seeing black people in all walks of life: kings, traders, priests, soldiers. There wasn't a single type to fix prejudice on. Second, identity in antiquity was defined differently. The real dividing lines were citizenship, freedom, and language. Were you a citizen or a slave? Could you speak Greek? Were you part of the empire or outside it? Those were the questions that shaped how people saw you, not necessarily what you looked like. Third, the ancients lacked the pseudoscientific framework of race that later Europeans invented, that whole idea of biological inferiority. To the Greeks and Romans, human differences were more about environment, climate, or culture. In short, race as biology hadn't been invented yet. But Snowden doesn't romanticize the past. He's clear. There were stereotypes. Sometimes black people were exoticized, or used as symbols of foreignness. In Roman comedy, for example, African characters might be used for humor. Some writers associated black skin with heat, with distance from civilization. But even then, those ideas didn't form a consistent system of color prejudice. They were fragments, not doctrine. And crucially, blackness wasn't shameful. It might be unusual, but it wasn't unclean, or unworthy, or damned. Snowden's book also traces how, by late antiquity and the early Christian era, ideas about human equality began to evolve further. Early Christian thinkers emphasized the unity of all mankind, that all people were descendants of Adam, all souls equal before God. In that sense, the moral imagination of the ancient world still had space for inclusivity. So when and how did color prejudice really begin? Snowden hints at the answer. Much later. The racial ideologies we're familiar with, the ones that tied slavery and exploitation to skin color, came with European expansion, the Atlantic slave trade, and colonialism. That's the 15th to 19th centuries, not the first. For him, understanding the ancient world shows that racism, as we know it, isn't eternal. It's a historical construct, which means it can also be undone. That's the larger philosophical takeaway of Snowden's book, that human difference doesn't have to become hierarchy. The way the ancients saw blackness, sometimes curious, sometimes admiring, rarely hateful, proves that our categories are neither natural nor inevitable. He invites us to imagine a world where diversity is a given, not a threat. A world where color is a description, not a destiny. Snowden's scholarship itself is worth a moment of reflection. He was an African-American classicist writing in the 20th century, at a time when the study of Greece and Rome was almost entirely white and Eurocentric. His research was both academic and deeply personal, a reclaiming of the African presence in the ancient world, and a rebuttal to centuries of distortion. In that way, Before Color Prejudice isn't just about antiquity. It's also about the modern imagination, how we choose to remember, how we read the past, and how we decide what's possible for the future. Let's recap Snowden's main points before we close. The ancient world had regular contact with black Africans, and saw them in many roles: warriors, rulers, traders, citizens. Skin color was noticed, yes, but it wasn't moralized into a fixed hierarchy. Slavery wasn't race-based. You could be black and free, or white and enslaved. Cultural difference mattered more than color. No biological idea of race existed yet. That came much later. And most importantly, the way the ancients viewed blackness challenges our assumptions about what's natural or inevitable in human prejudice. So, listening to Snowden today, we're reminded that our world, divided, racialized, often still struggling with the legacy of color prejudice, doesn't have to be this way. There have been times, whole civilizations, that saw human difference differently. And that history, Snowden says, is worth remembering, because it gives us permission to imagine something better. I'm glad you joined me for this exploration of Frank M. Snowden Jr.'s Before Color Prejudice, The Ancient View of Blacks. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who loves history, or who thinks deeply about how the past shapes our present. Until next time, keep asking, what stories have we been told about race, and what might history really say instead?